Hello and welcome to this masterclass on PAS 2035, the new British standard for domestic retrofit. This is part of the Social Housing Retrofit Accelerator programme and is designed to help local authorities and social landlords hoping to access funding for the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, or just generally trying to develop good strategy in the world of domestic retrofit. So the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund is a £160 million programme. It is designed to help sort of kickstart the national retrofit programme that we need to see across up to 4 million social housing units across the country, social housing homes. So a big programme, and this is the technical support programme in support of that. Quick introduction to myself. My name's David Pierpoint. I'm the Chief Executive of the Retrofit Academy. My contact details are on the screen there. If you'd like to talk to me at any point about anything to do with retrofit, you're very welcome to get in touch. And indeed, if you have any questions on this presentation. The Retrofit Academy is a community interest company. Our vision is a world in which there are 27 million warm, healthy and low carbon homes in this country. And we're best known for developing and delivering the Retrofit Coordinator qualification that has sort of helped to raise standards and put PAS 2035 into practice. So more on that role later. This is BSI PAS 2035 and its companion document BSI PAS 2030. This is a specification for how retrofit projects should be delivered, and it introduces a new process for retrofits that, if observed, should lead to good quality outcomes for all concerned. PAS 2030 is the installer standard, and is best seen as being a chapter of the book. And the book's title is PAS 2035. It's a bit confusing that there's two standards. PAS 2030 has been around for some years, hence it was updated. PAS 2035 was then introduced, and they've sort of been put together. So there's only really one standard, PAS 2035, that counts. Why do we have this standard? Why is there a need for it? And the pictures on screen here illustrate that need. These unfortunately are of properties where retrofit has taken place and it's been delivered in a defective way, and it has led to some really unpleasant unintended consequences, particularly in terms of damp, mold, condensation, rot and so on. So this is very prevalent in suboptimal retrofits. In 2013, it was established that 13% of all external wall insulation retrofit projects resulted in type A fails. Those are the type of fails you really want to avoid. Some pretty hideous examples. You can see here the sort of poor detailing, lack of attention to detail, and so on and so forth, which leads to some pretty appalling situations. By way of a case study of an often used one is the area of Fishwick near Preston in the northwest. This was a £5 million retrofit project delivered in 2013. You see defective installation, lack of design, no ventilation strategy. The consequences of it are widespread mold and condensation, and the cost of remediation on that project to date has been £6 million. Harder to quantify has been the unintended consequences and the impact on those people's lives who live in those homes. So that is a much higher figure in reality, and of course that's been going on for nearly a decade now, and is still in some cases unresolved. So we want to be avoiding retrofit projects like this, particularly as we scale up and start delivering retrofit at significant scale, which is what the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund is there to encourage you to do. So we want to see less of that. We want to see more retrofit that you can rely on. Now, why do we have PAS 2035? Put simply, it's because going back into the last decade, the ministerial postbag was full of complaints, and that led to the commissioning of a review of the sector called Each Home Counts. was in the second half of the last decade, and it made around about 20 or so key recommendations. I'm just going to focus on two of those. The first recommendation is the introduction of the quality mark for the sector, the trust mark, and that means that projects delivered under that banner you should be able to rely upon in terms of their quality. Sitting underneath trust mark, the organisation, are all the accreditation schemes for these new roles that have been introduced, and also for installers. You might recognise some of the names there. Now, the trust mark require full compliance with the code of practice that was developed off the back of BSI PAS 20. Each home counts. That code of practice is BSI PAS 2035. So that was also sponsored by the government. The good news now is that everything has been aligned such that government funding through SHDF or the Local Authority Delivery Scheme or other retrofit programs also requires compliance with the trust mark, and therefore compliance with BSI PAS 2035. So you can't now deliver retrofit under any of these funding programs which doesn't work in that way. So this is something you need to be aware of and get involved in. Now, I often ask people when running workshops like this what their perceptions of PAS 2035 are, both positive and negative. And some of the more common themes that come up are, in terms of positives, that this is a process that leads to sort of quality and robust solutions that clients can rely on. It's about introducing professionalism into the game. There's Sam Warburton, the former Welsh rugby captain, who was a consummate professional. We want to see people we can really count on coming into this space. We want competent tradespeople, people who understand their job and know their job and are delivering quality outcomes. And ultimately, we want to see a retrofit process which is quick and efficient and lean, which gives us a good chance of delivering the up to 27 million retrofits that we need to see over the next 30 years or so. In terms of negatives, people often comment on the complexity of the standard. It is a 90-page document. I won't pretend it's not without the odd flowchart, but it's really not too bad as standards go. They talk about a lack of capacity in the supply chain, so not enough people holding the right qualifications yet, which is certainly true, but is evolving. And then people tend to talk about cost. So what's the cost of complying with this standard? And people see it as a bureaucratic cost, rather than thinking about it a cost which is going to lead to the sort of outcomes that you see on the left-hand side of the screen there. So there are undoubtedly current positives and negative perceptions. I'd just like to challenge a few of those today. Now, I mentioned flowcharts. We try and keep these as simple as we possibly can. And what you see on the screen there is the fundamental PAS process. So this is how the steps we want people to go through when they're delivering good quality retrofit programs. Now, we're going to break those down into 6 steps today, and look at each in a little detail. And I'd like you to go away from it with some clarity on what those 6 steps are. So the key thing is, we're not trying and get across everything about PAS, all 90 pages of PAS 2035 and all its peccadillos and peculiarities. It's just really the very fundamental stuff that you as a client would need to know. So as well as that process, I'm also going to be talking about the PAS 2035 roles, some being better known than others. Retrofit Coordinator, I've mentioned, the Retrofit Assessor, the person carrying out the assessment of the property, a Retrofit Designer, someone who carries out design work on these projects, an installer who installs the stuff, an advisor who provides the homeowner with advice, and an evaluator who checks at the end of a project that things have been done as they were meant to be. So those are the 6 roles introduced by PAS 2035. The other thing it does is it breaks each project down into a risk pathway and says that there's an appropriate way to manage each stage of the retrofit project. So there's a low, medium and high risk assessment, and you can see there's a row for each. And then it says in each stage of that project, those 6 stages I've already mentioned, which of these individuals can do which of those things. Okay, and again, I'm not going to go into the detail of that today, other than to let you know that that is laid out in the PAS, which seems like a pretty sensible thing to me. And you'll notice that the Retrofit Coordinator symbol there, the circle surrounded by the 5 circles, is pretty prevalent there. So they're overseeing the whole thing, but also they're able to fulfill several of the roles in the PAS as well. So a bit more about these coordinator people. Their job is to, they're a qualified individual who's a specialist retrofit project manager who takes overall responsibility for the delivery of these projects. Their job effectively is to ensure that PAS 2035 is put into effect. Crucially, particularly in the context of social housing, the PAS also says that their role is to protect the client's interest and also the public's interest. And fundamentally, they're doing that by ensuring that the projects you're getting don't look anything like those horror pictures I showed you earlier on. And it raises some interesting questions when you're thinking about how to develop a supply chain around that question of client interest, public interest, and the conflicts of interest that might give rise to. So yeah, he's there to protect Mr. Smith and your interest as a client too. The PAS also introduces a few key concepts. I'm not going to go into detail of these today, just try and debunk a bit of the jargon. So the first key principle that the PAS introduces is a fabric first approach. This is the idea of insulating a building comprehensively with a view to reducing how much demand there is for additional heat and power. Heat to warm it up and power to use all the appliances and so forth. So the approach that the Fabric First recommends is using super high insulation, optimizing solar gains, whilst ensuring that that insulation is adequately ventilated and avoiding all those mold and moisture issues that I've shown you evidence of. So that's a key concept. Now, Fabric First doesn't mean fabric only. It means that you address the fabric first, then you look at the building services, and then you look at renewables. So there's a misconception that retrofit's all about solar panels and heat pumps. They are part of retrofit, but they're the bit that we address after we've addressed the condition of the fabric of the building. The second key concept is whole house retrofit. You'll hear this often. And as I just mentioned, this is really just progressing the fabric first approach. It's about considering fabric and services and renewables as one system in effect rather than as individual elements. This term is often misunderstood as meaning doing a very deep retrofit all in one hit, improving all this stuff in one go. Whilst that is a very viable and sensible approach to many retrofit projects, it's not always viable in terms of budget or time or many of the reasons. So it doesn't mean that, it means thinking about the whole building, not individual elements of it. Building physics is fundamentally about addressing issues relating to moisture and damp on the one hand, and the thermal performance and efficiency on the other. So we want that. We want the thermal efficiency. We don't want the moisture and damp issues. There's a lot to this. It is a complex area of building science that not everyone understands. And PAS 2035 really says that if you're going to be doing retrofit, you do need to have that understanding of those areas. Not something that we're all taught, unfortunately, in our education, but our Retrofit Coordinator course sort of drums into people. Now, as social landlords, you are making decisions about how you're going to get to net zero, and you're going to be faced with the opportunities that some funding presents to you on the one hand, and trade-offs that you may need to make because you may not have enough funding available to you right now to do all the things in the way that you might want to do them. So you're going to have to make some tough decisions. An example of that would be when we have an external wall installation project, whether we should move the existing glazing assume we're not replacing it, in line with the insulation layer. So the external wall insulation we're putting on the outside of that wall. So here you see the existing wall on the left hand side, that's the purple rectangle. You see the insulation layer on the outside of that's the dark purple rectangle, and then you see the window that's been left in its existing position. Now it is certainly more expensive to replace those windows in the short term, but what you can see is that when we don't move those windows into the insulation layer, you're left with those horrible bright colours on the thermographic image. That means that we've left behind one of these dreaded thermal bridges, which is going to lead to issues with damp and mould and condensation. So you're solving one problem in terms of improving thermal performance, but you're sort of leaving behind a legacy of another. So good practice, certainly the Retrofit Academy would recommend that you do move those windows into there, and you can see when you do, you eliminate that horrible thermal bridge and you don't get the issues with both heat loss and moisture. Now, is that practicable always? No, it's not. And you are going to be faced with those decisions. Where possible, we encourage social landlords to do EWI at the same time as window replacements. And when they do, always make sure that you do make that change, because that way you're not storing up a problem for tomorrow. And of course, if you're replacing the windows anyway, you're not incurring additional cost in real terms. So the 6 stages of PAS 2035. This is a really complicated diagram. We're going to look at these in a little detail. So step 1 are intended outcomes. This is where we identify what this project should deliver. Step 2, the risk assessment. Step 3, the dwelling assessment. Step 4, planning and design. And step 5, installation and handover. And then finally, step 6, monitoring and evaluation. So let's take a little look in detail at those, bearing in mind that here our Retrofit Coordinator we've introduced here is responsible from one end to the other. And I want to stress that point because there are lots of people out there in the minute talking about PAS 2035 and saying that you can introduce a Retrofit Coordinator at step 6 or step 4 or whatever. You can't. You can introduce a Retrofit Coordinator at step 1 and they stay involved all the way through to the end, usually the same person. So please be careful of anyone who's telling you differently. So, intended outcomes. This is simply an exercise in terms of identifying what it is we're trying to achieve through this retrofit project. So is it a particular level of thermal efficiency and performance, or a certain carbon saving, or an improvement in indoor air quality? There could be many reasons, many motivations, many things you want to achieve for a project. So this is where a retrofit coordinator in discussion with a client will identify what is realistic and feasible and list them. And then using those intended outcomes, we'll then start to build a project that's appropriate to delivering them. So there we go. Step 1, intended outcomes. Step 2 is our risk assessment. This is a process again conducted by the Retrofit Coordinator, which the end result of which is putting this project into path A, path B, or path C, as in triaging the risk, and then the PAS outlines how those projects should be managed. It's a simple process. It's not to be overcomplicated. It assesses the number of dwellings, the number of improvement measures per dwelling, the technical risk of those measures, the combination of those measures, and also what the building is made of, what its construction and build form is. A risk assessed grade is given to each, and the highest grade in any box is the risk pathway that project has to fail. So if they're all A's with 1 C, that would be considered a path C or high risk project. So risk assessment's not a complicated thing. And then when we triage those risks, the PAS there, the complex diagram defines what the risk pathway is. I use this ski slope analogy, green slope, a nursery slope, a blue slope, sort of, it's harder, there's more involved, and PAS C is a red slope, really pretty tricky and not to be taken lightly, only for the professionals, I suppose. Now, dwelling assessment is an area that PAS 2035 revolutionises. So we're all pretty familiar, I think, with sort of EPC assessments. A lot of you as social landlords also have that data. This is very different. This is an assessment that's commissioned by the Retrofit Coordinator. So they brief an assessor what to do, what they need. The PAS says what the mandatory requirements are for that risk pathway, but the coordinator may decide that they also need additional information. Far more in depth, they will take much longer and they will cost more money than the average EPC assessment. Most of those EP assessments will take 15 minutes to an hour. They don't collect enough data to give the Retrofit Coordinator the information that they need to do their job properly. Nonetheless, it's carried out by a retrofit assessor, and that is the job that they are limited to doing unless they're otherwise qualified. Crucially, every dwelling must be assessed, and that includes every flat within a block of flats. So you can't just do one archetype and say they're all the same, because they're not all the same. And it's about data collection only. The retrofit assessor, unless appropriately qualified, is not able to give advice. And it must be signed off by that retrofit coordinator. So if they haven't collected all the information they need, the coordinator needs to get that assessor to go back until the job is done properly. I mentioned EPCs, they have their place. It's a helpful guide. It's pretty superficial in many ways. By way of comparison to the familiar EPC, I've put here a PHPP or Passive House Planning Package model that we've used on projects, and you can see the kind of data that's collected here is far more in depth and gives us the kind of data that we do need to make the right sorts of decisions. There are alternatives to this. Not telling you that you should all commission PHPP modeling, but it is a certainly very valid way of going, as is FullSAP. Step 4 is about planning and design. Now, this is where the retrofit coordinator really comes into their own. There are 3 steps involved, so sub-steps within step 4. The first is the creation of an improvement option evaluation. The second is the development of a medium-term plan for that property. And the third is ensuring there's an appropriate design solution in place for that property. So a little more information on those. Here is an improvement option evaluation. Using the Retrofit Academy's PAS 2035 software. The purpose of the improvement option evaluation is to establish the best measures, the combination of measures that will deliver the intended outcomes. It also informs the sequence, the order in which those measures should be introduced. A great example of that is if you're doing EWI, do the windows at the same time, or vice versa. There are many others too. Ultimately, this will calculate the carbon cost effectiveness of certain measures, the future fuel costs, and the payback period. So it allows a retrofit coordinator to sort of play around with various different scenarios and combinations to come up with the best model, the best approach for that particular property. A medium-term plan is a 20 to 30 year plan, recognizing that most retrofits can't be paid for all in one go. So we're going to be coming back in 2, 3, 4 different stages to complete these projects. You can see here again an example of a medium-term plan developed by the Retrofit Academy. It provides a route to the optimal retrofit for that home. It is bespoke to that property and to the kinds of people who live in it. It will take into account what funding is available now, what funding is likely to be available later. Introducing this concept of staged retrofit, so doing it in sensible chunks, the right combination measures at the right time, over a long time horizon. And it will even take into account future trigger points. So, for example, if a plan is developed with a young family who say that they want to have a new child in 2 years, and that will lead to the need to adapt the home, or that children are about to leave and go to university, and therefore, change of use likely, and all that kind of stuff, that will all be taken into account into a good medium-term plan. And when they've been developed, they'll be lodged in the Trustmark data warehouse. This is the repository for all this stuff, all the assessments and everything else, which means that irrespective of who lives in those properties or who owns them, these will be available irrespective of tenancy and tenure. Okay, step 5 is about installation, testing, commissioning, and handover. This is, as I said earlier, the section that's often covered by that is covered by PAS 2030. Now, the Retrofit Coordinator's role in this is oversight. It's not to manage the construction site, it's to ensure that what is done on that site is compliant with what the plan has been, what has been come up with in earlier stages of the process. And it's to hold the installer to account if they deviate from that plan, and to approve any decisions they may want to, any substitutions or changes they might want to make. So it's an oversight role, and that is where I mentioned conflicts of interest earlier. That is where the most likely conflict of interest would give rise. If your retrofit coordinator is employed by the installer, then clearly there's a potential conflict of interest that would need to be managed. So there are issues here around reporting lines and around control too. Okay, the final stage, monitoring, often makes people think of really detailed technical monitoring. It need not mean that. Good projects that have been delivered well will only need a step 1 on this front, which is a basic questionnaire. Step 2, if that doesn't work, would mean an independent retrofit coordinator would need to be brought in order to look into in more detail as to why things have gone wrong. Step 3, if that doesn't work, means bringing in, throwing the kitchen sink at the problem. So it's independent, and it really does mean sensors and in-depth monitoring stuff. So we want to avoid those. If we do pass properly, the vast majority of projects will be handled through a questionnaire. So that's everything I've been asked to cover. There is more information available from our website, including PAS 2035, what is it, what does it mean for you, and our compliance maps, which are available to download for free. We've also just published a guide called Contracting for PAS 2035 Compliant Retrofit, which is specific to local authorities and housing associations. That's also available to download from our blog page on our website. So I hope they're of use to you, and good luck with your retrofit projects. Thank you.